Hello friends, my name is Emile and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today it is Creator's Choice 2. This is essentially where I just take a pick and mix of various vehicles I've wanted to see go around the Top Gear track for a while. We start today with the Porsche 911 GT3 RS 4 litre, 500 horsepower, 2,998 pounds of weight. The Porsche 911 GT3 RS, I actually reviewed this car all the way back in Horizon 2. I compared it to the Aston Martin V12 Vantage S and I liked it very much. However, upon driving the V12 Vantage S in Forza Motorsport 6, I found it wasn't quite as good as I remember it, so I was kind of wanting to see if the 911 GT3 was much of the same. It wasn't. This car is still fantastic to drive. It really is great through the corners. It will just dive into the corners, the rear end's super planted, it's got a lot of downforce, so that means it just swoops through the corners effortlessly. It is pretty brilliant. Straight line speed, well, it has 500 horsepower, which is a decent amount. So it is pretty quick. It has downforce, which does mean the top speed is restricted, but it isn't bad in a straight line. The only real issue I was having with this vehicle was some front end lift. You'll actually see the camera sort of herking and jerking through here. The reason for that is essentially the front end just sort of starts to lift up. It's a bit of a 911 issue because of their rear-ended nature, but you do get some front end lift. Thankfully it's not the wheels like it is on a rough CTI Yellowbird, otherwise I'd have some major issues. So yeah, anyways, next up we got the Ford RS200, 506 horsepower, 2,464 pounds of weight. The RS200 has 6 more horsepower than the Porsche and weighs about 500 pounds less, which is pretty crazy. Now the RS200, I've always wanted to take this around the Top Gear track because I think it's kind of an interesting car statistically. It's an A-Class car, however it doesn't really have the stats you'd expect of an A-Class car. Most A-Class cars are, you know, they have fantastic top speeds, decent acceleration, and they're okay through the corners. This, according to the game, has really good handling, really fast acceleration, but it has no top speed. The reason for that is just the gear ratios. It's one of those Group B rally cars, so it does have very, very short gear ratios. So how does the RS200 actually drive? Well, it's nice. There is quite a bit of understeer to contend with though. This is a four-wheel drive car with a lot of power. You'd kind of expect it is an early four-wheel drive car as well at that. So you'd kind of expect it. Thankfully the suspension is actually quite stiff on this vehicle. With most of the Group B rally cars, or rally cars in general, you'll find they'll sort of just rock about on the suspension a lot. Happens with the early Evos and the Lancer Delta S4. Thankfully in this vehicle it's nice and hard. I do go for a handbrake turn through the final corner there just to get it round easier. Next up we've got the Mercedes-Benz A45 AMG, 355 horsepower, 3,263 pounds of weight. The A45 is a hot hatch, which I've always kind of been curious about because this is essentially the ultimate hot hatch. It has four-wheel drive. It has 355 horsepower, which is more power than pretty much almost anything in the hot hatch category. It does weigh quite a bit, although that is due to its four-wheel drive system and so on and so on. So yeah, this was sort of the ultimate hot hatch, if you will. So what is the A45 like to drive? Well, there is a hell of a lot of understeer in this vehicle. This is a ridiculously understeery car, probably the most understeery of all of the hot hatches, to be honest. It is not particularly nice in that regard, and that really does slow it down around the track, which is a bit of a shame because the rest of this car is pretty good, other than the gearbox. Now, you've heard me complain before on this show about gearboxes, you know, long gears. McLaren F1, Ford GT40 have ridiculously long gears. The A45 has stupidly short gears, and it has, I believe it's like a 7-speed gearbox in this thing, but most of the gears, there's only about 20 miles an hour in them, so I was always going for third, or fourth, let's say, and I'd have to go for fourth, even though I really want third, but if I go for third, I'd bang on the limit. If I go for fourth, it's a bit too low, which was a little bit strange, and I didn't really like that about the A45. Next up we got the Ford F-150 Shelby Raptor, 575 horsepower, 6,200 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today. It's also the heaviest by far. So the Shelby Raptor, we've had a lot of Raptors go around the track, especially in recent times. We've had the 2017 Raptor go around, we've had the standard 2011 Raptor go around. I believe that was actually in the last Creator's Choice episode. I was kind of curious to see how the Shelby Raptor would cope compared to its peers, and to be honest with you, it is a great car. It's actually really nice to drive, which you know, you don't expect that from these pickup trucks. You'd expect them to be hell to drive, you know, you'd expect them to wibble about on the suspension a lot and have loads of understeer and everything. granted, you can feel all of the weight in this vehicle. £6,200 is an awful lot, and you can feel it all in this vehicle. But saying that, other than that, it isn't actually that bad. It's quite nice. One of my favourite things about the Shelby Raptor is the noise. It makes a fantastic noise. That supercharger wail is just, it's so good. It really is a fantastic engine note in this vehicle. But yeah, the Shelby Raptor is nice to drive, which you, like, again, you wouldn't expect it from this. This is an almost 600 horsepower super truck, but it drives really nicely. Is it the best of all the four-wheel drive cars or four-wheel drive SUVs and trucks? No, I mean, I believe the BMW X5M does drive a lot nicer than this does, but the X5M basically just drives like a Super Impreza, which is just crazy to me. Anyways, next up we've got the slowest car of today. This is the Ford Capri RS3100. 148 horsepower, 2,315 pounds of weight means that this is the lightest car here today. However, it is by far the least powerful. So the Capri, I was curious about the Capri. Because it kind of sits in a bit of a weird sort of class. I was expecting this to sort of compete with the Holden Thorana and maybe the Holden Commodore, sort of those Australian muscle cars that don't quite have the power, but they are relatively light. The Capri, well, it was nice. I mean, that's really the only way you can describe this car. It drives like a 1973 sports car, really, just with a bit less speed. It is surprisingly quick, I will give it that. However, it is by no means a fast car. 148 horsepower is not a lot at all. You will see it sort of lean through the corner. Suspension is a little bit soft, but it's a 1970s car. You'd kind of expect that from it. It's not as bad as, say, the Holden Thorana or some of the muscle cars that we had around not too long ago. Yeah, the Capri is alright, though. I can't really say much more than that. It doesn't oversteer, thankfully. Doesn't really understeer. You do get the occasional one-tyre fire. Again, I'm assuming because it's an old car, it's probably got an open differential. Which obviously means that you do get the one-tyre fire syndrome. But it isn't too bad on the Capri. It isn't doing it through every single corner, which is quite nice. And yeah, the Capri was a pretty decent vehicle to drive. If it had a bit more power in it, I can imagine it's very, very good. Next up, we've got the Abarth Punto SuperSport, 177 horsepower, 2,612 pounds of weight. This was one of those cars that also got left out of the modern hot hatch video. I've always been curious about the Punto. I went with the Abarth 500 in the end just because I thought it was a little bit more interesting than the Punto, because, you know, the Punto is kind of like the Fiesta and so on, while as the 500 is a little bit different. It sits in a class on its own. The Fiat Punto, though, is very, very slow. I will say in a straight line, this is probably the slowest car of today. I don't think it's that much quicker than the Capri, but it is great. It's fantastic to drive. This really is a fantastic hot hatch to drive. You know, I like the way the Fiesta ST drives and the Abarth 500 drives, but to be honest with you, the Punto just has a bit more grip. I mean, look at the amount of speed I can take through those corners. It's insane. The handling on this car is really, really good. It's fantastic. It really is just brilliant. As I said, straight line speed, you can see it. It's got no straight line speed whatsoever. 177 horsepower. I mean, it's okay for hot hatches. When you compare it to the modern ones, it just hasn't got really that much power, but it isn't bad. But, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just some aerodynamic issue or something, but this car has no straight line speed, but it has all of the corner grip. It's fantastic through the corners. Give the Punto a bit of a go. It will surprise you. I bet most people overlook this car. Anyways, we move on to the Alfa Romeo Sprint Zagato. This is our last car of today. 207 horsepower, 2,778 pounds of weight. Now, this was a car I had lined up in the single cars episode. Unfortunately, no one ever voted for it, so yeah, it's here now. The Sprint Zagato, I wanted to try this car just because it's one of the most kooky, weird-looking cars I've ever seen. It's such a strange car to look at. Personally, I really like the way it looks. From the back, it is a bit weird, but from the front, I actually really like the way this car looks. You'll have to develop your own opinions on it. The Sprint Zagato was decent. There was a bit of understeer in this vehicle. I actually originally, going into this episode, thought this was a front-wheel drive car. I believe it's rear-wheel drive. You actually see off the start line spinning the rear wheels, so I'm definitely assuming this is a rear-wheel drive car. Yeah, it does have some understeer. It will occasionally kick the tail out as well, although not as bad as, say, on a Mini Cooper, John Cooper Works, which really does like to kick its tail out. That's got a bit of snap oversteer in that car. This hasn't got snap oversteer. It's a decent car to drive. Straight line speed's alright, 207 horsepower. To be honest with you, I believe I drove this just after I finished driving the Punto, so anything feels quick compared to that Punto. That Punto was quite slow. But yeah, the Sprint Zagato was a decent enough car to drive. I really liked it. I believe this cost a ridiculous amount of credit, so I wouldn't really recommend buying this car, but certainly give it a go if you do have it. Anyways, onto the times, and the 911 GT3 was the fastest car of the day, going to 34th with a 1:16.031. That is very, very quick. Beats out a Lamborghini Gallardo, Ferrari 599, beats out a load of supercars. That's stupidly quick for a Porsche 911. That's fantastic. Honestly, that time is great. Moving on down the board, we find the RS200 in 49th with a 1:17.380, which is a pretty decent time. I mean, it misses out just on the four-wheel drive supercars, but it beats a Lexus LFA, Caterham Superlight, Corvette C6ZR1. A quick time again for that car. We move on next to the A45 AMG, going into 100th with a 123.598. Beats out a 2015 Ford Mustang, two Skylines, Audi RS4 Avant. Pretty good time, especially considering that it's a hot hatch. That is stupidly quick, 4 seconds faster than a Golf R. Moving on down, in 144th, we find the Alfa Romeo Sprint Zagato with a 129.141, beats out a GMC Cyclone and an MX-5. The Abarth Punto goes into 137th with a 129.548, beats out a Fiesta ST and an Abarth 500, which is very good. And finally today, the Ford Shelby Raptor goes into 162nd with a 132.381, beats out a 2017 Raptor, and the Capri goes into 169th with a 133.593. Does beat out a old Mazda Miata though, so that is quite good, all things considered. Anyways, friends, I hope you have enjoyed watching this episode of the Forza Top Gear Laps. Next episode is, of course, going to be community choice, so I will be making a video on that later on and telling you how you can submit the vehicles you want to see for that episode. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. My name's been The Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.